All right, well, hello to everybody out there on the internet. You probably know me. I'm Emma, and I'm very happy to invite Beck, who's in the USA, and Freya, who's in the UK, to have a chat with me today about their experience of having an anonymous donor. The reason I picked Beck and Freya to have a chat with us is when I met them and I heard their stories, it sounded like they had relatively ideal conditions in terms of the way their parents approached donor conception. And so I thought, taking aside what other things can go on in DCP world, it'd be really interesting to hear their perspectives of how having an anonymous donor affected them over time. So maybe Beck, if you can give us a very brief introduction just of your family setup and I guess like where you're from, and then we'll do the same for Freya, and then we can get going with some of the questions that we've been asked to address.
Yeah, so donor conceived in the beautiful Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as you say, I was so lucky to have known from forever is my experience of it, that I was donor conceived. And, full credit to my parents who were told by the doctors, never tell her, just pretend that this is your own biological child, keep it a secret. And they had the foresight to think that was probably not a very good idea. So that was a huge gift to me, and it became even more of a gift given that my dad died when I was 9. And I think the trauma of losing him and then finding out that I had no biological connection to him would have been overwhelming. But I always knew that we had no biological relationship, and it freed us up to have just a wonderful relationship that was based on something else. I was very much daddy's little girl, and I think there was an honesty and authenticity to that relationship. And it would have been really tarnished if I had found out after he died that we weren't biologically connected. Yeah, and I wasn't growing up with other siblings. It was a bit of a complicated childhood in the sense that a few months before Dad died, Mum had nearly died as well. She was still in hospital recovering. And so there were lots of moving parts, but at least the donor conception part had been approached honestly and truthfully, and that ended up being really helpful.
That's great. And it's so beautiful to hear that phrase, freed us up to have like an authentic, true relationship. I love that. Freya, maybe you can do a quick introduction as well, just your family setup and a little bit about, where you're from and so forth.
Yeah, so I'm from the UK. I've got 2 mums, and they conceived me in the 90s using a sperm bank in London. They were only given the option of anonymous donors. They did briefly look at the idea of known donors, but my biological mum, who was going to carry me, felt really uncomfortable with that idea. I think she had a lot of fear that someone would want to sort of step in and take that parent role and take me away, was how she sort of phrased it. So she felt a lot more comfortable with that. My non-biological mum was actually quite sad a lot of my childhood that we had an anonymous donor, and she regretted that I wouldn't get to know that part of me. But we talked about it a lot. It was very casual conversation in our household, and I've got a full sister as well, so conceived using the same donor, and both of us, it was just incredibly normal really for us. And yeah, despite being anonymous, I have since found my donor through an ancestry site. So the last couple of years we've sort of had a relationship which has been really lovely, especially sort of on a similar theme. I lost my biological mum a few years ago. So it's been really lovely having a new input of my background and my heritage and learning that side of me when I've kind of feel like I've lost some part of me as well.
Yes.
But I'm getting to learn a whole other side of me as well, which has been really lovely, especially since becoming a parent. also using donor conception to conceive my daughter, but that made me think a lot more about donor conception. So having it all tie in at the same time as finding my donor as well was a lot, but it was a really nice way of getting myself sort of more comfortable with the idea of where I came from and things like that. Definitely.
It sounds intense, the whirlwind. But can I also clarify, Freya, it feels like you've always known, like it's just been a part
Always
of you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which I think is so powerful, and that's something we advocate for parents to try and achieve for their own children, that it's just it's normal. There's no before and after. So a couple of questions, I guess, about your relationship with your parents. Do you feel genetics has made a difference to the relationship you've had with your raising parents?
For me, no, not really. I feel actually I grew up feeling a lot closer to my non-biological mum. A lot of the time we just had that the personalities worked a lot better than me and my biological mum. So I think if anyone was to suggest that I would for some reason bond with my biological mum more than my non-biological mum, I would have laughed, because that definitely wasn't the case. So in terms of growing up, I didn't feel like that was a big input for me personally.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Beck? Do you feel genetics, and I feel like you've touched on it already, but just to be really clear for everybody out there, do you feel genetics has made a difference to the relationship you've had with your parents?
So zero difference in terms of the relationship with my dad. It was a total non-issue. He was my dad. He was the person who was caring for me and loving me, and we got on really well. So biology doesn't determine that. I will say, like Freya, after a lifetime of searching, 2 years ago, almost close to the day, I found out who my biological father was, and he died when I was 2, which was in some ways, I mean, I would have given anything to have been able to meet him, but it took the pressure off, in the sense that I had spent my life feeling like I was racing against the clock to try to find him, and knowing that he died when I was 2 meant that there was nothing I could have done differently. But to the point of genetics, having now met his family, which has just been an extraordinary experience, it's not that genetics are irrelevant. They're hugely relevant, but not to the relationship that you can have with the parent that's raising you.
That's a really good point, Beck. Yeah, absolutely. So if we're talking about, searching for donors, we've kind of touched on that. Do you remember what age you started feeling curious about the donor? Or even, were you curious? And obviously I know you were curious because you started searching, but what kind of age do you feel like you started actually thinking about it?
Gosh, it's hard to pinpoint an age. There was part of me, so I was always told there were no records, and that is in fact the case. I verified that, and there were no records. And so I would never be able to find out. And I just never believed that to be true, against all evidence and logic in a pre-internet era. I just believed that someday I would be able to, I don't know, by magic figure this out. And I think it was only when I was sort of, and I'd left home by 15 and left school, and like I said, there was a lot going on. But once life had stabilized a little bit, and I got to college, it's when it sort of finally hit that the only way that I was going to be able to find this information was if I found it myself. And that's when the really intensive searching process started.
Yeah. So kind of sounds like late teens, you got quite serious about it, but it sounds like you were thinking about it before that.
Yeah, but not in any kind of, like, not in a negative sort of way. It was a curiosity, and I think particularly, I'm quite different in a lot of ways from my mom, and I was looking to see myself reflected somehow in someone. And the crazy thing is, so left school at 15 or whatever, and then had this really just set of experiences that were so unlikely in terms of, you know, ending up at Harvard Law School on a scholarship and now becoming a law professor. And it was so far removed from anything in our family experience. And then, you know, it turns out my biological father was a law professor teaching the same subject I teach. I mean, you just can't make this shit up. So that would have been
so good.
amazing as a, you know, I wouldn't have felt so like such a crazy person if I had known that all along, I think.
Yeah. That is so fantastic. And we hear that so often, these weird coincidences that aren't, it's just your genetics. They code for a lot more than what we realize. Freya, if we're just continuing on this sort of curiosity, and also I would just say it's probably quite hard for people who have anonymous donors, particularly from our era, and also depending on which country people are using these days, is you don't have a lot of information. And so often as a child, you're probably told you won't ever find out, you won't know about them. And so then, or there's no records or so forth. It's hard. You feel curious, but you also feel there's like an emptiness there because you've been told you won't ever know. Or certainly that was my experience. But Freya, what about you? Did you remember, you know, when you started maybe thinking about it a bit more, and did you become curious?
I think my curiosity was always around siblings. I remember having a lot of conversations with my mums about the fact that at 18 I could find my siblings, because that was a big thing. I think because it was such a narrative for me that I knew I wasn't going to be able to find my donor. I was okay with that. I really didn't ever have that moment of being upset about it, which now I kind of look back and I'm a little bit surprised in a way, but I just didn't care. But I was very interested in siblings, and that was from quite a young age, I'd say. I definitely remember having a conversation in the car when I must have been about 10 or 11, because a radio program came on and it was about long lost family or something. And me and my mum had a really lovely conversation about finding siblings when I was older. But I do kind of now look back and think I was quite naive, because the conversation was always, I will find my siblings at 18. We didn't discuss the fact that it was very possible I wouldn't, that I would join the HFEA link, which is what we have in the UK, which I could join at 18, and I would join then. And in my head I thought, I'll suddenly have all of these people that would all be there. I knew I was one of the oldest, so I thought, well, maybe I'll have to wait a little bit till they all turn 18. And as it happened, nobody joined until I was about 22, and then finally I got an email. So it was a long wait in terms of me building that up until I was 18. And that was hard because all of my interest was around that. In terms of the donor, I was curious in the ways that I was curious what he looked like sometimes. As I got older and became a moody teenager, I was often curious if he had the same kind of interests as me or hobbies as me, especially because me and my mum clashed so much. I thought, well, maybe I get this from him or something. But it was never much of a longing. It was just a kind of passing curiosity. Like you said, it was, yeah, just I think when other people asked me questions, they thought I'd be a lot more sort of desperate to know, when I was a bit kind of like, I don't know. I just shrugged it off. So yeah,
It's hard, you know, and I think as a teenager, there's so much going on anyway that you do have these sort of passing thoughts without necessarily becoming very intensely able to focus, or even it's almost like too big a concept for a teenage mind to really grasp.
Definitely.
I've often had conversations with people who are not donor conceived, who sort of have a working assumption that I would have had a picture in my mind of who my biological father was, and I didn't, because I had nothing. It's not like I had a little bit of a profile that you could construct something around. If you have a total black hole of information, then there's just nothing.
I literally had eye color, hair color, weight and height, and obviously I knew he donated when he was a student because it had that on the profile. So I was like, he's not going to be that weight is he anymore. He's not going to have, and so the picture was very fuzzy if I had a picture at all, because I knew that the likelihood was it was going to be, you know, it would have changed by then. It was things like, they said he didn't have children, but that was at the time of donating, and I was like, well, yeah, because he was a student. So all that kind of thing, I knew very well that that picture was, there was no way that was going to be reliable. So there was no point in my head of having a picture. Like, it just felt unnecessary.
What kind of information would you have liked to have had about the donor?
I would have been interested to know things like what he was studying, things like what his hobbies were, not just, it had a really basic like interest, and it was like sport. And actually now I know that he runs marathons and things like that. Like, that would have been far more interesting to me to know those little details rather than just interest in sport. Yeah, and I got a lot of there was a lot of kind of casual, I don't know if this was the same for you, Beck, but the doctors would just tell my parents information about the donor rather than it being written down. And so my parents were told that he was a street performer, and my parents were both musicians, so they loved that. They thought, oh, that's brilliant, that's a little bit of same as us and all this. And so I was really brought up with that picture, really. And every time I went to Covent Garden in London, I looked to see if anyone looked like me, you know, just casually. I was like, oh, I wonder. Knew that was kind of silly, because it's probably, the likelihood was he wasn't anymore, but I did think about it. Turns out that was completely false. He wasn't a street performer, but the guy that he donated with at the same time, his flatmate, was. So they'd just given the wrong piece of information verbally. It was that casual. So yeah.
A bit disappointing, the false narrative.
The false narrative. I had zero narrative. There wasn't so much as eye color or hair color or which, you know.
Yeah. What would you have liked back? Like, what would have felt like enough?
That's a really hard question to answer now that I have a really complete picture. Because if you'd asked me before I found out my information, I would have said anything, because I had zero, right? And so anything would have been a gift. If I could have had eye color or hair color or height or ancestry or any piece of it, would have just been the kind of gift that would have made me cry at the time. Now that I have a really full, robust picture, and his relatives, my relatives have been so generous in painting that for me, anything else would feel insufficient. But I do think, you know, to Freya's point, it's if you think about that journey into kind of figuring out what your own identity is, that the people who are not donor conceived are also going through in sort of teenagehood and early 20s and maybe longer. Things like knowing little details of what they were studying, or like you said, the marathon thing, just tangible details of what a real life looks like for this person whose DNA you carry.
That makes sense. And we've touched on this as well, but to be really clear, you were told you would never find the donor, but did you want to find the donor?
No question. It wasn't. Yes. And, you know, again, to my mum's credit, and she was doing this all on her own because Dad died, she was fully supportive of that. Now, I think it became a lot more difficult when it actually happened, but at least in principle, I think she was really curious as well, because she was finding it hard to make sense of this person who was going off doing things that seemed incomprehensible. So yes, there was no question in my mind that I always wanted to know. And I think, you know, that gets to a bigger and really important point that sometimes gets conflated. You can do and should do the kind of model job that I feel like my parents did in terms of honesty, and it, you know, opened the way for an amazing relationship with my dad that has been kind of the rock of my existence in many ways, notwithstanding how short-lived it was. you can do all that. It's not a substitute for being able to find out the information about your biological parent. So these are two different things, and however well you do on the one front, and you should, in terms of honesty, it doesn't substitute for the information.
Yeah, really important point. Parents have to expect that some children are going to want to find the donor even when they have been told you won't find the donor. It's not possible. They're anonymous. They don't want to find you. That doesn't mean we're not going to still search. What about you, Freya? I mean, I know a little bit about your story that you sort of found the donor by accident, but do you recall at any point, did you actually want to find the donor despite being told you wouldn't ever find them?
My whole childhood, no. Really didn't think about it, didn't think about it as a concept, and therefore didn't really want it. I really can't say that I wanted it as a child. The only time I think I started thinking about it was when I started to find siblings, because I found my first two half siblings through the HFEA donor sibling link, and as part of that they give you a counselling session on the phone. And I remember at the end of the phone call she said, also if you'd have the same counselling session again if your donor chose to make himself non-anonymous. And I had no idea that was a thing, something that I'm now attempting to revert. I'm hoping the HFEA will listen to us and realize they need to do more of a campaign, but I had no idea that was possible. And so that kind of planted a bit of a seed in my head then of going, oh, well, maybe he will, maybe I'll get a phone call. And then I sort of realized I could get a phone call any day for the rest of my life telling me that he'd made himself non-anonymous. And then I started to think that that was very unlikely, because why would he suddenly decide to do that? And I think that was the only time when I really started to think the reason I was getting annoyed about that was because I wanted it to happen, and I actually did want to find him. And then the curiosity kind of just grew, really. So when I did do the ancestry kits, no, I wasn't doing them with the aim of finding him, but I did always have it in the back of my head that it was a possibility. But yeah, up until I was about 22, I hadn't really thought about it. But it was funny how it just suddenly became something I cared about, really, and didn't go away then once I did start thinking it.
Yeah, and look, I think it's totally makes sense. You know, as we said before, like there's so much going on in childhood and teenagehood, you know, getting through those early university years. There's not a lot of space to be like soul searching about your absent anonymous donor parent, you know. And it's only when you start to, like, I feel like when I was in my 20s, it was like I woke up, you know, like I was like, oh, I've stepped through all that crap, and I can actually see a bit more about who I am, and possibly that's when the more intensive curiosity may start to come about for some people, although obviously some people do experience that much earlier. What was, I guess touching on, you know, finding the donor, and, you know, we spoke earlier, some parents, we're hearing some parents are purposely choosing anonymous donors even in this day and age because they feel like that will protect their child from worrying about being rejected by, for example, like an open ID donor who may or may not agree to long-term contact. They think, if I choose an anonymous donor, they definitely don't want contact. I can just say that to my child. It won't be this sort of will they, won't they, and that's going to be beneficial for my child. So I guess my question is, did you, not that you necessarily sounded that kind of specific about finding them, but did you worry about being rejected by the donor?
I didn't, but I did have a moment when I first sent him the email, because I was given his email address at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not someone that tends to take much time to think things through, so I literally replied the next day. And my first line in the email was, I understand you signed up for full anonymity. If you still want that, I understand. And my personality is I tend to think about other people's feelings far too much. So I think a lot of that was me going, I need to look after him, and I wasn't thinking about how I felt. But I did also kind of have this feeling of, I was protecting myself doing that, because if he did turn around and reject me, I could say, well, that's fair enough, and he signed up for this. But I don't think I expected him to reject me. And I've now heard so many stories of people being rejected by their biological parents when they do find them, and it hurts my heart, because I don't think I even considered it as a possibility. And it's very sad that for some people that is the case. I was welcomed with open arms, and I'm overjoyed by that. And I can't imagine another scenario now, which is lovely for me, but I sort of am so aware that it's not the case a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's really hard to hear those stories, and just it's heartbreaking. What about you, Beck? Did you worry when you started kind of finding closer genetic relatives in your search? Did you worry about rejection?
Yes and no. So at the beginning, which was 20 years ago now of searching, with no records, no online DNA testing, it all seemed so impossible that I just had zero expectations of anything. It seemed so unlikely that there wasn't space to even let myself dream of finding him. And so it was only over time, as I started, with online DNA testing, and it really happened very quickly when it finally happened 2 years ago, finding a second cousin through DNA testing. And there was that moment where I was reaching out to someone who I thought would be a family member through social media, where I thought, do I really want to do this? Do I want to sort of hit play on this, because I can't hit unplay after that, and this is the closest that I've got to finding a family member. And if they say we don't want anything to do with you, then I'm kind of out of hope. So there was definitely that moment, and also the first email that I got from one of my half siblings, one of my father's children directly. I haven't found other donor siblings yet, although you've seen me go through that process as potential half siblings keep coming into my orbit. But the first email that I got that was confirming, yes, this is your biological father, was from my half sister, who said very clearly she didn't want anything to do with me. And that was the first email that came through. And it didn't touch the sides at all when I read it. I was just like, I'm so grateful that you nonetheless confirmed this information. I felt nothing but warmth for that. Now, subsequently, other parts of the family said that's not our view, and welcomed me with open arms, and that was even better. But I think I just, I grew up knowing that it's a little bit like what you said, Freya. I knew that the conditions were anonymity. I might not have liked it, but I understood that that was the deal that people signed on to before I had any choice in the matter. And so that was always kind of the baseline that might be exactly where people were staying. And just, filming, so I made this documentary before online DNA testing, when I went around Aotearoa, New Zealand, having put out classified ads in the newspaper asking for anyone who'd been an anonymous donor. And amazingly, people who we know came forward. And that was a real, I think everyone thought that I was crazy, and why would someone who had been anonymous be willing to put up their hand, do DNA testing, let alone do it on national television? And I think that taught me a lot, not to assume that people who donate anonymously at one period in time don't then go on to have their own children, to grow in their thoughts about what biological connections mean. And so to leave the door open for people who have been anonymous donors as well.
Yeah, and it is a good point. There's some research on that is a proportion, a relatively significant proportion, that higher than what you would expect, that anonymous donors are actually often open to contact. And just for the hilarity value, just so everyone out there knows, my donor is one of the men who came forwards in response to Beck's newspaper ads 20 years ago to have a DNA test with Beck in case he was her biological father.
Yeah,
So,
it's a small world.
so
That's
funny.
a lovely story.
Yeah,
and
so
he was,
cute.
you know, there's a very, very warm place in my heart for him because it was one of, I think he was the first DNA test actually. It was like there are people who went through this program that was without records, completely anonymous, who are nonetheless putting up their hand to say, I'm open to this.
So I guess in summary, it's interesting. We didn't necessarily worry about being rejected because we never thought we would find them, but it didn't necessarily stop us from wanting to know them or starting a search. And I love this quote from you, Beck, no space to let yourself dream, you know, because it was almost like a self-protection mechanism. I don't want to think about it too much. I don't necessarily want to put myself out there because I don't know if there's anything to find. I don't want to hope because I might never get there. And it would hurt too much. I guess one big one that parents definitely want to know about, which comes up a lot, so we'll kind of move on to this now, is do you feel angry?
No. No. I have absolutely no ill feelings at all towards my parents for choosing an anonymous donor. I understand that the way they saw it, that was the best option for them. And in all honesty, I think it probably was. They had no one in their life they could use as a known donor. I can't picture anybody having that same relationship with them where my mum, my biological mum, would have felt safe enough to. And I get it. I've now gone through the process myself. I've used an open ID donor with my daughter, but I had to make those decisions too. And that made it even clearer to me that they made those decisions thinking of me, even though I didn't exist. And no real feelings at all.
What about you, Beck? Do you feel angry?
So I was trying to pass this out because it's not at all angry in the family personal context, but I feel huge anger at the system, right? The it is not as though there was no. So part of this, you know, we do this, and I do this all the time. Look, you know, I understand it was a very different social context, and closed adoption was still the norm, and et cetera, et cetera. And there are lots of justifications that are make it explainable that you would use fully anonymous donors and not consider keeping any records. I just cannot believe that people who fundamentally, you know, we're part of the same program led by Professor Bonham, this incredibly intelligent individual who was wonderful to many of his patients, to not have had the foresight to think through the implications of doing this really, really frustrates me. And that's not something that anyone who's in the fertility industry likes hearing. And, you know, I can certainly, this is me being more kind of, I hide this part of my reality in most of those interactions because it's usually not, it doesn't serve any benefit, except when it can be harnessed to say, well, let's really make sure that whatever systems we're setting up going forward are putting the reality of a person who is not just a baby, but who is going to go on and be a full adult, thinking things through from their perspective. And I think it's, you know, if there's any anger, it's that, well, maybe we can explain the position that the medical profession was in at the time and the thinking of the time and the social context, and it was sort of seen as a brave thing to do against the morals of the church and so on. Okay, so fine, we get us there, but even today, I still feel like there is this narrative that donor conception is about producing a baby for parents, I just, that seemed like a really wrong way of framing up the situation.
My donor said that he always spent the rest of his life picturing anyone born from his donors as babies. And he said that was definitely to do with how they talked to him when he was donating, and how it was treated as this kind of, you know, that there'll be the babies conceived from this. It was, he sort of said it was, he now feels silly, and he was like, I know I was foolish to think that, but I couldn't shake that image that was in my head that it was just babies. And sort of like seeing now that I have a daughter that is an adult, he was sort of like, I know that sounds silly, but I'd never pictured that. Yeah.
That
That's
is
a problem
so
with
telling.
society. Yeah, and it's a problem with society overall, though. Like it does apply to donor conception, but doesn't it apply to just anyone who gets pregnant? You know, there's all this focus on being pregnant, reading the pregnancy books. There's no focus on how to actually raise a child. It's all about how to get a baby, and so it's a fault of donor conception, but it's a fault of society too, where don't think ahead as to how we're actually going to raise this child, look after this child. Imagine if we put all that effort into reading, you know, child psychology books or something.
Yeah.
Like, it'd be different. Okay, so talking about anonymous donors, and you know, if we've got lots of viewers and parents who have used anonymous donors, what would you say to them? So they've already made the choice. Maybe they didn't have all the information they have now. They may have different feelings about anonymous donors to what they once had, and they feel an array of things. It might be guilt, they might feel sad, they might feel shame, you know, but they can't change it because they've got this beautiful child now that's in their family. What would you say to them, I guess, to support them, to like, how can they help the situation going forwards?
I would say make it very clear that you are your child's ally in this journey, whatever it's going to be. And you know, we can't forecast what a person's level of interest will be in trying to find that information. And certainly there will be some donor conceived people out there who have no interest in searching. But if that's not your child, if your child is someone who wants to search, hopefully there's been enough of an open communication established around donor conception in general, which gets back to our earlier point about telling the truth and early. But if you've got that foundation, then it gives you the space to really know what your child is truly thinking about. And kids are so good at picking up the signals that we send as adults. I'm now the mom of 4 kids. They will pick up if this is sort of feels like a no-go area for you. And that's not the relationship that you want to have with your kid. And so you need to do some work. They don't know what's in your head, but you are signaling it in your behavior all the time. And if you don't want the signal to be that this is a topic that you're uncomfortable talking about, that you feel guilt around, then you're going to have to do something to signal to them that this is good ground for us to figure out together.
Yeah, it can be a point you can bond together over that kind of collaboration and openness. What about you, Freya? Like, any thoughts for parents?
I think don't let the lack of information that you have prevent you from still talking about them. Even if you feel that you have 3 facts and that's it, and you can't do much with that, which I've had some people say to me. I think my parents still tried to create that narrative. The street performer, yes, it was wrong, but they did have that story that they talked about with me. They still brought it up on their own without any prompting from me when we were visiting places like where they had live musicians. Those kind of things were very important to me because, like you say, Beck, it is showing that they are willing to talk about that with me. I didn't have to be the one to always raise that as a point. They were opening that door to me. And I had somebody ask, how do you talk about the donor without turning them into this mythical creature and giving them all this power? And I think that for a starter, I don't really ever understand that narrative, but I think that's the answer, talking about them. I think if you don't, and you leave it as this, I don't like the narrative when they say a kind man, but you know, have this kind of, a kind man did this for you and that's it, and you never hear any more, that's turning them into a mythical creature, because you just have this kind of concept of this amazing person and no grounding information about them. So I just think having it as normal conversation, and admitting that you do regret bits. Like my non-biological mum would always admit that. She talked about it a lot. She said she didn't like that choice that they'd made, that she'd often thought about this, and she didn't let the fact that I could turn around and say, yeah, I am annoyed about that, she never let that stop her from admitting that. I know I didn't tend to turn around and say, I never actually said that. I never said, yeah, I am pissed off about it. But I didn't need to, because anytime I did feel ever so slightly sad about it or thought about it, I could just go to her, and I knew that because she'd opened that door already.
That is so powerful, and that is so beautiful that your mum could, Gaggy, could be like that for you, you know, and as you say back that word ally, your ally in this, and your ally in the feelings, you know, she felt the feelings too, and she wasn't hiding them from you, you know, like trying to protect you. She was saying like, this is okay because I feel the same way.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, well, we've got a little bit more time to talk about a couple of other things. One question we got was, how real was the concern about dating a sibling? Did that ever occur to you?
I had that worry quite a lot, actually.
Oh dear.
I know, I think because I thought about siblings more, I definitely thought about the concept of, when I looked at the table I was given when I was 16 of the years and genders of my siblings, and I thought, we're all in a 4-year period and there's 16 of us. 16 of us? 18, 16 of us. There's a lot of us. And I did genuinely think that I'm about, at that point, I was thinking, I'm going off to university. People go off to university and come from all different parts of the country. Who the hell knows where I'm going to end up, and who I'm going to end up with? And I did think about it a lot. And I think now about it occasionally, because now I've found 4 of them. The gay members of the sibling group are winning at the moment. There's 4 of us, and 2 straight members. And my half sister is gay. She said she's fine with me talking about that, and is in a similar age to me. She's in about 2 years younger than me, and I've moved up north, and I'm a town over now from where she lives. And so if I hadn't found her, I do think occasionally about the fact that we could have matched on a Tinder, you know, website or something, because of the fact there's not a huge amount of lesbians in every area. Like, you do end up knowing people. So yeah, I did think about it quite a lot. I do still think about it a lot. I'm not dating, I'm married, but I've still not found a lot of them. So I do, it's a pondering of mine quite a lot.
Yeah, and as a teenager, oh my God, that would be like quite a stressful thing to, on top of everything else, have to worry about whether they're actually your brother or sister that you're interested in. That's really stressful. What about you, Beck? Did you ever think about that?
I didn't have that at all, but I think that was a product of the fact that I moved countries at 15. So I was sort of, it just didn't seem very likely because of that.
And interesting from our era, like, it was never talked about with me, with my family, that there might be other siblings out there. I had no concept that there might be. It just wasn't even an idea. And we also moved countries when I was around 13. So going into teenagehood, I never ever thought about it. But subsequently, you know, we found out that my sister's, she's got a different donor, my sister's sister went to the same school as us. She was the year below me. Like, they were right there. They lived around the corner. And so sometimes the sibling, and many other people have stories like that, the siblings can be a lot closer than you think. So for some people, it's a real concern. And I've even heard other people say, oh, I only date people of a different ethnicity to me as a insurance policy.
That's one way of protecting yourself. Yeah.
Another thing was how your relationship with your genetic family, is it settled? Is it still evolving? Like, I think for other people, and I guess this is also a question for DCPs, when you start that relationship, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty and it's one thing. And so going forwards, does it change over time? Does it sort of, is what it is right from the start? What's your experience been?
I think mine's evolved quite a lot. With siblings, it was kind of stayed fairly similar. We found each other and bonded quite quickly, and that's been lovely. But with my donor, when I first started exchanging emails with him, I really had the kind of approach in my head of going, well, this will be nice. We'll email back and forth. I'll get some information about him, and that's kind of all I really want. And then I kind of went, oh, well, he wants a phone call. So yeah, maybe we'll have a phone call or two. And then we started FaceTiming sort of every other week. And then we met up and now I'm like, I'm looking forward to when I'm getting to see him in May next, and it feels ages away. And it's kind of, I sort of was thinking about this randomly on the bus today, actually. And I was like, it sounds weird to say, but I'm actually really fond of him. And he's my biological father. So that feels like, yeah, fair enough.
Why is that weird?
Yeah, I know. But it's sort of, I don't think I'd let myself feel very emotional about it, because I was putting up a bit of a wall from the moment that I met him of protecting myself, probably for fear of rejection, or just fear that he might turn around and go, actually, this is a bit much. I only really wanted an email. So I was like, well, if I do that first, I'm not going to lose anything. And now that we've relaxed into it over 2 years, I'm actually letting myself think, oh yeah, I really like him, actually. Like, we get on really well, and I'm looking forward to talking to him. And it's taken a lot to break down that wall that I didn't even realize was up for a while. But yeah.
It's so beautiful to hear that it's like flowering. What about you, Beck? Because I know your donor's passed away, but you've got a relationship with some genetic family. How is that developing over time?
Yeah, so right now I'm back in DC, but I had this incredible, and it feels horrible to say this because it all happened because of COVID, because I was teaching online, which meant that I could teach from New Zealand, albeit at 2 o'clock in the morning, and moved the whole family back, and was living like 5 minutes away from my brother. So that was just such a, I don't know, a gift is the word that keeps coming to mind, because all of this was nothing that I had ever had an expectation of as being mine. You know, I think what has been a complicating factor in my scenario is that there's a generational offset. So my biological father, generations wise, would have been my grandfather. And so his children are my mum's age. And so then there's a whole lot of, so I have nieces and nephews who are my age. And then there are questions of like, what are these labels that we put on relationships really mean? Can you be closer to, you know, a brother who is your parents' age than to a niece or a nephew who is your own age? And so we're
fascinating.
we're all kind of been figuring that out. And I think that was probably particularly difficult for mum to get her head around as well, because suddenly I had all these relatives that were also part of her generation. And the other thing is, you know, in her sort of conception of our family, it was just her and me. And my biological family is huge. I mean, huge. And we had this reunion. For me, it was just a union for the first time when I was there. And, you know, there's 30 of them in a room, all these people who look like me. It's incredible. But I think was really overwhelming for mum. And so, you know, that's all in process, I think. And I don't know how it would have been different if he'd still been alive.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's understandable. I think I can empathize with the raising parents feeling a degree of jealousy towards the donor, and I guess feeling a degree of jealousy when that relationship starts to evolve. And, you know, we talk a lot about parents doing some inner work to kind of strengthen their own feelings of you know, there's a lot of trauma in for the parents as well as the DCP potentially in this whole way of creating a child. And some of that, you know, if it's not addressed and resolved, then it's going to come out, right? Especially when these like sort of triggering things happen, like you find the family and have to actually face this is real. Yeah, so we definitely would say, you know, look for support, professional support to talk about these issues because they're huge and we want our parents to be able to support us, but obviously they need to support themselves to be able to do that. I guess one last thing before we wrap up, and this has just been such like a great conversation. So thank you both for taking the time. But growing up, we've talked a lot about terminology on our Instagram account and had lots of conversations with parents. When you were growing up, what kind of language did your parents use? You know, donor, just a donor, biological parent, genetic parent, like did they use any specific terms? And also, how do you feel about it? Did you think they were just a donor? Did you have in your mind that they were a biological parent?
You go first, Beck, if you want.
No, go for it. Oh no, not while you're having a smell. Okay. So donor was the term that was used. And you'll have seen in this conversation today, that's a term that I don't use anymore. Although I used it as a child because that was the language that was used. Now I talk about my biological father. And there's a bunch of interesting issues to unpick within that, right? Because I think at this vantage point, I feel like the terminology of donor did distancing work. And it, you know, that was not in any way intentional. That was, you know, the terminology that was being, I think, just sort of repeated because that was what had come from the fertility clinic. And I do have this sort of strange memory that's particular, you know, one of those ones where you can place yourself in time. It was one evening that it hit me for the first time that donor, this is going to sound so stupid. It's not that I didn't know that the donor that we were talking about was my biological father, but I never let, in my internal narrative, I never let myself use the word biological father, parent, nothing. It was like there was this, it had to be donor in my head. And the sense of kind of freedom and rebellion almost when I let my purely internal narrative, nothing that I was saying out loud, acknowledge that actually what we were talking about was my biological father. And I remember that distinctly. And now it would just feel weird to talk about a donor for me, in the sense that those relationships that I have with his children and grandchildren, the word donor just doesn't gel within it. They didn't know him as a donor, so they can't talk about him as a donor. They talk about him as the person that he was, and so I'm relating in the same way.
Yeah.
What about you, Freya?
I think very similar, actually. My parents used donor. Again, the clinic told them to use donor. It was the language that was used. And I don't have an issue with that. And I do still partly use donor, which was weird, I think, when I then entered the kind of DCP sort of online sort of stuff only when I was pregnant. That was the first time I really joined all of that kind of thing. And I was met with a kind of, oh no, we don't use donor. And I sort of wanted to be like, but I do. I was like, I sort of had a weird sort of identity crisis where I felt like I wasn't allowed to, and it was sort of strange. And now I've settled with, no, I do still sometimes use it. It was what I used, and to break 26 years of that was very strange. But since meeting him, I then did start to change to biological father in my head. And then when explaining him to other people, but I found that interestingly, people that were comfortable with using donor before I knew him, when I then met him, started using dad. And that was really weird to me because I was like, nothing's switched in that. And I tried to say to the people that would be like, oh, so you found your dad? And I was like, well, no. I was like, that's not, no. And but my non-biological mum, Gaggy, she turned to me like a sort of the first time we'd met him, and she was like, does he feel like your dad? And I was like, well, no, because that's not what he is. And a sort of, I'm really comfortable with biological father, and sometimes I even slip the biological bit and just think father in my head. But I think dad will never quite be that. But it's interesting to me how it's still evolved, and it will sort of probably always evolve. And I tend to use his first name and then donor tacked on to the end when I explain him to other people, because my half brother has the same name as him. So I have, which was bizarre, I think, when he found that out. And I have a lot of people in my life with the same name. So he's just got this kind of little extra title of just first name donor, as if it's all one word. And that just kind of works for us, really.
Yeah, I certainly have no memory of any terminology, but I remember in my head, I thought about him as biological father.
Mm.
Can I just jump in on that? Sorry, I've got a naked little person trying to get into PJs here. So just on the dad terminology though, that so resonated because dad was the person who raised him. That's it for me. And there's no way that I biological father or father, fine, but dad is in my head the person that was there.
Mm.
Yeah, so most DCP aren't looking for the donor biological parent to replace their raising parent. We see them as an extra, a bonus, a completion, but not a replacement.
Mm. I like
Beautiful.
the term bonus. That's a good one, actually.
This has been such a lovely conversation. Thank you both so much for taking the time out of busy family lives to have this chat. I really hope that parents get some things out of it. I've certainly got some things out of it. So I really appreciate just your honesty and also your sensitivity in approaching these really complicated issues. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And lovely to meet you, Freya, and thanks for all the educational work that you're doing on this front, Emma.
Oh, and to all of you, we are all doing our bit. Freya's great. Beck, you've already done so much for the DCP, so we'll just chip away, and we're all just doing it for other people's children. Really, we just want the best outcomes that we can achieve slowly.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Right,
Well, goodbye,
care,
everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.